The special representative of the President of the United States, Steve Witkoff, is meeting with Russian President Putin in the Kremlin during his last chance visit on the eve of the possible introduction of new sanctions against Russia and its energy partners by American President Donald Trump. Let me remind you that Witkoff's visit was supposed to take place a few days before today's meeting between the American representative and the Russian president. As reported, Witkoff was expected to arrive in the Russian capital immediately after his stay in the Middle East. However, instead of that, the plane carrying President Trump's special representative returned to America, and only now has Witkoff arrived in Moscow. Apparently, while Steve Witkoff was in Israel, there was absolutely no clear understanding or mutual agreement between the Kremlin and the White House regarding what potential compromises might be genuinely possible in the complex and evolving situation that arose on the very eve of President Trump introducing new and significant sanctions against the Russian Federation. In the official video footage widely distributed by the Kremlin's press service during the significant and highly anticipated meeting between the distinguished American special envoy and the esteemed Russian president, it was notably observed that there were no longer the warm, traditional, and customary embraces that had so profoundly shocked the entire world during Witkoff's previous, much-discussed meeting with President Putin. It is clear that the special representative of the American president is taking into account the fact that the Russian president no longer enjoys the same favor that Putin had from Donald Trump back when the American president, for some reason, was convinced he could reach an agreement with his Russian counterpart to end the Russian-Ukrainian war. Now it seems such illusions no longer exist, if not for Witkoff, then at least for Trump himself, who continues to threaten Russia with sanctions and may even announce certain decisions just a few hours after the meeting between the American special representative and the president of the Russian Federation. But something else is also obvious. The President of the United States is not at all certain that his sanctions will in any way affect Putin's determination to continue the war on the Russian-Ukrainian front. And in this way, of course, he would like to prevent the introduction of new measures against the Russian Federation so as not to reveal that the President of the United States actually has no real tools to influence the Russian Federation. And everything that Donald Trump has said since being elected President of the United States was nothing more than ordinary political bluffing and a miscalculation stemming from Donald Trump's lack of understanding of the very essence of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict and Putin's intentions toward Ukraine. Thus, concessions from Trump to Putin are also required, even if these concessions do not lead to an immediate end to hostilities on the Russian-Ukrainian front. Does Putin need to make any compromises with Trump? This is, of course, quite an important question, since the Russian president may believe that the energy sanctions imposed by the President of the United States will not affect the Russian budget, but instead will help bring Russia closer to the People's Republic of China and to India, who, together with Moscow, will be forced to resist American pressure. And in this situation, the continuation of the conflict between Beijing and Washington, as well as the creation of a conflictual situation between New Delhi and Washington, will contribute to Putin's further political and military plans. This is indeed the case if the Russian president is supremely confident that major global powers such as China, India, Brazil, and other significant countries that are currently acting as energy sponsors of the ongoing Russian aggression against Ukraine will in fact not cease their crucial purchasing of Russian oil. After all, one can make militant statements, defend one's own sovereignty, emphasize that Trump will not dictate anything to anyone, and yet ultimately make decisions that will support the American president's sanctions and undermine Moscow's economic capabilities. If Putin believes that such a turn of events is possible, he may make certain concessions to the White House to give Trump the opportunity, at least for another 50 or 60 days, to refrain from imposing any new sanctions against the Russian Federation and its allies. And in this case, both Trump and Putin, of course, would breathe a certain sigh of relief. So, what kind of concessions could the Russian president make to his American counterpart? First and foremost, we can talk about the so-called air truce. That is, Putin will insist that his troops will continue military operations on the territory of Ukraine and possibly expand this front after the upcoming exercises in the Republic of Belarus. However, there will be absolutely no massive, widespread bombing of Ukrainian cities and towns. And in this particular way, Donald Trump will not be able to credibly claim that the Russian Federation is deliberately and systematically destroying Ukraine's innocent civilian population. This very fact could serve as a good argument for the American president that he is succeeding, if not in stopping, then at least in beginning to stop the Russian-Ukrainian war. For Putin, this scenario could be acceptable for several reasons. The first is that Ukraine would also be unable to strike Russian military facilities and oil refineries, allowing Putin to accumulate both money and military resources for a future war against the state he so despises. In addition, a situation may arise that could help destabilize Ukraine itself when there will be no war in the areas where there are no hostilities, and when it is concentrated exclusively in the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia regions of Ukraine, where heavy fighting will continue for a large part of Ukrainian society, as we already saw after 2014. The war, so to speak, will disappear from the radar, and the pressure on the Ukrainian leadership to seek agreements with Moscow will increase. Even if we were to imagine that Vladimir Putin somehow manages to survive in this current precarious mode for some considerable time, and then, eventually realizing with absolute certainty that he simply cannot seize any significant Ukrainian territories, he ultimately decides to completely stop all military actions, Russia would still potentially have a renewed opportunity for a new political comeback in Ukraine, especially with the eventual emergence of a new charismatic Ukrainian leader who would then promise to reach a comprehensive and lasting compromise with the Russian president. We have already been through all of this in 2019, which became a Rubicon in Ukrainian society's attitude toward the challenges associated with the continuation of military actions. And ultimately, as we know, all of this led to February 2022, to the start of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine. But Putin may not be thinking that deeply simply because he might not fear Trump's threats and believes that continued bombing of Ukrainian cities and towns and the destruction not only of the civilian population but also of infrastructure will force Ukrainians themselves to consider real capitulation to Russia and deprive the Ukrainian army of the weapons it needs to resist Russian aggression. What decision the Russian president will make and how the president of the United States will respond to it, we will find out, if not in the coming hours, then certainly in the coming days. And what can be said with confidence is that any such decision will not lead to a quick, meaning months, or perhaps even years, end to the war on the Russian-Ukrainian front. Thank you, friends. Stay tuned to this channel, subscribe to it,